Welcome everybody to this evening's webinar on online materials development. For our first session this evening, we welcome Dr. Tracy Seiler. She is a Latin teacher and also the World Languages team leader for the South Carolina Virtual School program. She holds a BA in Art History and Psychology, a Master's in Roman and Medieval History, and a PhD in Ancient History. She was also the 2015 South Carolina Foreign Language Teachers Association Teacher of the Year. And this evening, she's going to be addressing multiple modes of communication and balancing language skills in online materials development. So she will be speaking to us this evening about adapting available materials when they limit students primarily to using the interpretive mode, but do not promote interpersonal or presentational modes of communication. Tracy, are you there?
All right. So it might be kind of surprising that as a Latin teacher, I'm talking about this particular topic. It might be a little bit surprising just because I'm Latin and you know, Latin teachers are kind of known for just doing interpretive reading and oftentimes translation in particular, to the exclusion of other modes of communication. And in South Carolina, I think in 2007, we started moving to the actual IPA model for world language teaching, and Latin was asked to go along with it. And so we were sort of dragged kicking and screaming, and then we decided that we kind of jumped on the bandwagon and decided that it really was a good idea and it really was research-based. And so we started adapting the IPA model for Latin. Just recently, we rewrote standards in South Carolina that included all of the modes of communication on the actual model. Latin is also doing that. So hopefully what I'm about to say is going to make sense to everybody. So I think one of the biggest problems that we might have, and this is particularly in Latin, and then other modern language teachers can tell me if the same thing happens. I know it happened with our Spanish teachers, for example. When you're given a course to teach, it may not necessarily address standards or all the modes of communication in the way that we would like to see them do that. And so when you first get a hold of a course, if you're being asked to teach one that you did not design, one of the things that we'd want to check is to see if the course has measurable objectives that are linked to the state standards, whether there's unit or lesson plans, pretty much the overall structure. Do you just have a list of activities? I have seen some courses like that where there's, you know, a series of activities but no real cohesive theme or context for those activities. And then just checking to see overall what modes does the course address. Do you only have interpretive reading or do you have other modes there? And then what modes are missing, obviously. And then another problem there might be, and we run into this in Latin a lot, is whether the course materials are authentic or not. And you know, I think everybody would probably say that it's kind of hard to have completely authentic, i.e. in our case, written by a Roman you know, texts. And so in the level 1 courses in particular, where the students aren't necessarily able to handle that level of stuff, what kinds of things do we have there? And then also whether and this would be more apt probably for modern language people, but it does come into play in Latin too, is whether the materials are addressing real world skills and themes. And can we tie all the modes of communication to those themes in a way that's cohesive, makes sense to the students, aligns to standards, et cetera. And then the other thing is looking at how a particular level might fit into the overall language program for that particular language. Does it flow well? Does your school have a proficiency-based model? Is it, you know, in our particular situation in South Carolina's virtual school program, we're teaching students in private schools, public schools, homeschooled children all across the state, and we have everybody coming in at different levels. Some kids take all of their language preparation with us, and some come in at various spots. And so how do we deal with that type of an issue? And one thing that you might run into is that you're not given the freedom to change the course in the way that you think that it needs to be changed. And so I have a little bit of pep talk on advocacy here and how to convince maybe a reluctant administration that the course should be changed and can be changed, and that you are a good person to do that. So if you find that the course is not standards based, where you have an administration that does not want you to change the course, how can we get them to do this? And we did run into this problem at the virtual school back when I started. And so I think it really, really helps to advocate for that change, find out who the stakeholders are, and then you need to pitch it to them, essentially, that it is okay to change it. It's necessary to change it. We've got to have this course meet standards, for example, and that they do need to address all modes of communication. In Latin, this was a bit of a tough sell because the traditional Latin model is, of course, not that students speak it. They don't necessarily write it, so much less talk to each other in it. So, how do we advocate for that? And I think one of the things that we also have to sell, and we've made this argument repeatedly, is that just because it's online doesn't mean it needs to be second best, or that we need to maybe throw out one of the modes. Interpersonal communication is one of the ones that's real hard, I think, online, in a completely online course. That we don't have to just not address it or gloss over it because it's online. We really do need to address it. And I think it does help to find out who your potential allies are. So in my case, it was my state coordinator, and also state and national language advocates. There's people out there to help you with this type of a thing if you need it. The other thing I probably should say is that the changing a course, I mean, it kind of depends on how much change needs to be made, but if a lot of change needs to be made, I think that there needs to be space for that change to happen. You can't be given a course, in August with the expectation it's going to start in mid-September and be able to change the whole course. I think that anybody that teaches online knows that this is a lot of material potentially. And so one thing I would urge people not to do necessarily is to make, ad hoc changes kind of on the fly. I mean, I think it does need to be something that is well thought out. I'm trying to get my slide advancer. Okay, so there's big ideas here, obviously. Our courses are backward designed as much as we are able to do that. And I think that most people are kind of moving in that way. But if the course that you're dealing with is not backward designed, then what do we have to do? And I think that we really need to start with a big picture if possible. So we need to add, say, context if it's not there, themes, and objectives that I talked about before. That give a cohesiveness to the course over its duration, and then also leads well into other levels after that course, and so on. So I think that one of the things that I've seen with helping Latin teachers around the state of South Carolina is that the IPA is a little bit tough to bend your mind around. It's not always easy to understand. There's a lot of stuff in there, and so I think that it really, really does help to get into the standards and to plan the objectives first. And what do we want to hit? Where do we expect students to start at the beginning of a course? Where do we want them to finish out? And then from there, we can develop, units and lessons and activities. And then making sure that there is a good balance in the modes of communication and not just trying to, I mean, the temptation might be to fit stuff in, oh, we don't have interpersonal communication in this lesson, we need to throw it in, and make sure that it actually aligns well with what's going on with the other modes, your objectives, your overall, standards, etc. And then here in this slide, what we have, I hope everybody can see this. This is these are our standards for intermediate low level, which for me hits about Latin 2. And so these are the standards that we wrote, and these are the Latin standards. And so if you kind of take a gander at these, I mean, I don't want to read them to everybody, you can see that, we have and people can tell me, what are they dealing with in their state, for example. But our standards they're hitting all the modes of communication. And so I think everybody can probably read this, but the IL is for intermediate low, IR is interpretive reading, IL is interpretive listening, IC is interpersonal communication, PS, I don't know if y'all can see my cursor, but PS is presentational speaking, and then PW is, of course, presentational writing. We use the ICAN model for writing these to get them more student-centered. And so you can see, though, that even though these are Latin standards, they are, I mean, a lot of Latin teachers might look at these and think that they look a lot like modern language standards. And so what we had to do was to take these standards and then write objectives for the course that align with these standards and are measurable. And so here are the course level objectives for our Latin 2. And so again, we have interpretive reading, interpretive listening, and interpersonal communication, presentational speaking, and presentational writing. And so you can see there that, we want the students to be able to, in interpretive reading, for example, we want to kind of move away from the model where students are expected to take a passage, whether authentic or not, and translate it into English. We really, really wanted to move away from that and into a model where we're getting students to actually read and not use English as a middleman necessarily, but to be able to read, comprehend a passage, and be able to tell us what the passage is about in a logical way. And by the same token, we wanted, with interpretive listening, can they listen to an adapted authentic or an authentic Latin passage appropriate to their level, and can they comprehend some of that passage? Can they answer questions about that? And then here's the kicker for the Latin. This is, I don't know how many people are actually doing this at this point, but for us, we do have interpersonal communication. I'll talk a little bit about how we've used this or how we've adapted this to online. But we do want the students to be able to communicate in the target language with each other, not with their teacher necessarily, but with each other in a way that they can be understood and make themselves, they can make themselves understood and they can understand and they can, proceed through a dialogue. And then for presentational speaking, I'll talk about this a little bit more. We want the students for presentational speaking and presentational writing to actually be producing the language as opposed to maybe, for example, with presentational speaking, what I see a lot is that instructors will have their Latin students recite a passage that was written by Cicero. Can you recite this passage and is your pronunciation good? And we wanted to move away from that so that the student is actually, if they're reciting, but they're reciting Latin that they wrote themselves. And so this is kind of where we have moved, since I started teaching in 2000, away from translation. One thing that I was going to address was instructional materials, because this pertains to the topic at hand. Do we have to add them? Do we already have them? For Latin, we have a lot of, especially for the lower levels, but I've seen people use them. We'll have textbooks where the textbook is used from Latin 1 all the way through to AP, and there's no real deviance from that. Generally speaking, what happens is that in a standard cursus of Latin, what I've seen is that we'll use textbook Latin, what I call textbook Latin, for levels 1 and 2, and then they'll move to authentic Latin gradually in level 3. And we have really tried to move away from that. We do use textbook Latin with some additions of authentic Latin as we can. I still need to write a textbook. But in mid-Latin 2, we're moving into authentic stuff, or we're moving into Catullus, we're moving into Martial, as you're going to see, and Caesar, and then Latin 3 is completely authentic Latin, unadapted. And so sometimes it can be difficult for us to find materials, but we have a lot of stuff online, for example, that's available without you don't need a license. Latin teachers will know the latinlibrary.com. They have tons of texts on there that you can adapt or use straight up in your courses. And so if you're going to be adding instructional materials, you can create or adapt things. I think there's probably a lot more available for modern languages. The modern language teachers will have to tell me, but for instructional materials for us, I mean, these can be delivering instruction to students via video or podcast or whatever. They can be demonstrations of how to perform, right, for the students. How do you use these modes of communication, hopefully. And then of course teachers can add things into the course. If you see problems with a group of students where clearly the instructional materials did not address something that has come up that the students are all asking questions about, then we can add things there, and in terms of videos, podcasts, discussion forums, etc. And then there's a lot of materials that are out there. If you have a personal learning network, I'll call it, if there's lots of groups available, I know in Latin for support, and then there's a lot of people that have materials already developed, and so I always urge people, contact some other Latin teachers, beg, borrow, steal stuff. I've got troves of stuff that I'm happy to share that I've developed, as you'll see as we go along. Okay, so how do we add these things? So if we find that we don't have the modes of communication already in the course, how do we add them? What do we do? And so I think that the biggest thing that I see as problematic in planning using the IPA model, for example, is that there have to be enough formative assessments for the students to get comfortable using the IPA before we are actually going to test them on it. And so we need to add a fair bit of material. I mean, we just can't throw in a summative assessment at the end where we don't have them doing interpersonal communication. Then all of a sudden at the end of a unit or whatever, we'll say, hey, talk to each other in the target language. Let's see how you do. And so, we need to see a lot of that going on throughout the course. And so we build it into pretty much every lesson. They'll have, they'll have interpersonal communication in every single lesson. They'll have one of the presentational modes there, and then they always have interpretive reading, and they always have interpretive listening. And so we try and build it into everything. And I try not to make for my personal courses, I try not to make anything too huge stakes. If the students will make a mistake on that, then they won't necessarily pass the course or something, or they'll I try and build them up in various ways and not make anything too high stakes. Everybody can have a bad day. And so I think that there's a lot of ways we can do this that don't cause a lot of anxiety for the teacher to develop. And then definitely for our purposes, because of our student population, we don't want the students to have to go outside the course much, because we have a lot of students in rural areas with not great internet access outside of their school, and sometimes not great internet access in their school. And so I personally try to be pretty careful about sending kids outside of the course itself. And I try not to do too many different things. We do have a very diverse population. We have some kids that can access all that stuff. And so I think that one of the things that we can do there is that we can make, a range of possibilities that students can utilize to fulfill their their modes of communication. This is our State Department, South Carolina State Department unit plan. And it's a little bit, I don't have the whole thing here, but you can see what we're dealing with. And this would be the IPA, right? This is our summative assessment for a unit or so. And so we'll usually have a context. We'll have, you know, what's the interpretive task? What's the interpersonal task? What's the presentational task for this unit? Again, summative, you know, what are the language indicators from the standards that this is aligned to? We have cultural connections that we won't be talking about so yet, you know, pretty much at all tonight because of the nature of this thing. But you know, what sorts of formative assessments do we have the students doing? That's our performance assessments. What instructional strategies, et cetera, do we use? And so what I thought we could do is to play a little bit with one of these things. And I'm sorry that it has to be a Latin one for people that are not Latin inclined. So here's what I want everybody to do. And I figured we could do this in we could just talk about it, you know, for 10, 15 minutes. And see what comes up. And so what I wanted to do is I'll show you a partially filled in IPA unit plan. And then what I'd like everybody to do is look at the unit context for it, and I'll kind of explain what it is. And then, you know, can we make the interpretive reading a little bit better? What could we do there? Can we add, what sort of interpersonal task would we be able to expect these Latin students to do? And what kind of presentational tasks would be appropriate. And so the other thing that would be cool is if we could talk a little bit about what sorts of formative tasks would we expect that we would be covering in this unit leading up to this IPA. And so just a little background on this particular thing. Let me get this thing up. Okay, so here, I hope everybody can see this well and it's not too dinky, but this would be for a Latin 2 CP course. Okay, so we have here a unit on Martial, who is a Roman poet in the 2nd century AD, super sarcastic guy, lots of little poems, you know, kind of nice introduction to Latin poetry for students because he's mean as a snake, biting humor. The students usually come to me think, you know, Latin poetry is boring. The Romans are boring. And then they see Martial and are like, whoa, I didn't know that they could do that. They wrote about stuff like that then. So he's fun. And so what I did is I put in the context here for the IPA. And so what we want to say is, like, I can read authentic, unadapted poems of Martial. To discover how poetry can be used to explore the political, the social, economic, and cultural practices and philosophies of the Roman people. And I can compare these to modern society, poems of modern society. And so I thought we could just have at it. I don't know how this works, so hopefully Stephen's going to tell us. But everybody can jump in.
Okay, Stephen here, coming to you from Hawaii. Everybody, you are welcome to participate using audio, but please do be courteous and with your turn taking, and it's sort of like using a walkie-talkie. You can speak your piece and then you should switch off your mic so someone else can have their turn. On the other hand, you can also use the text chat window. So let's begin our discussion carefully.
I'll just say I can't see the chat, so because I'm on full screen with this PowerPoint. Oh, and we do have one interpretive task that needs to be fixed.
Okay, well, so far in the chat, there are a few things coming up. Adam is wondering how to say snark in Latin.
What would be like, gosh, what would we say for that? Snark. I know, I'll have to think on that one.
Sarcasmus. Anyway, anyone, you can jump in with your audio or you can use the text chat window. I'm working on a text chat posting myself at the moment. And to recap, our task is to change the task, translate 10 poems of Marshall into English, into a different kind of interpretive task, and then also to develop an interpersonal task and a presentational task that are related to Marshall's poetry as the source text.
Okay, Tracy, I'm going to go ahead and read you a few posts that are coming in on the text chat. This is Susan in Michigan.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Masako says that first students need to activate background knowledge, and then students need to be instructed to find a main idea, in parentheses, global reading, followed by detailed reading to understand context while discussing.
All right.
And let's see, another one, the student could start with Marshall's poem, then end it in their own way, give it their own personal ending. This is from Krishna Kavita, who says, my student takes Telugu rhymes and does this, writes his own moral at the end. And Hui Tran says, analyze the Marshall text and relate it to current events. Diane agrees this is a good one, plenty to compare with today's politicians.
Yes.
And also compare and contrast Marshall's poems with modern hip hop is another suggestion.
That's good.
Or synthesize the message and purpose of the poem. So let's see, so far that's what we have. Yes, a lot of applying to current politicians.
Yes.
Coming from, I believe, Stephen, interpersonal tasks, students could have a conversation using the insulting phrases and agreeing or disagreeing that those phrases can apply to certain people.
Yes.
And have students choose their favorite poem of the 10 and write in Latin why they like it. Ask them to identify specific words in the text that they feel work well. Finding poems by other poets that give the same message, maybe current poets. Compare Marshall's text to a current general's or military person's language. Let's see. So Annabella says, Dr. Seiler said at the beginning that no translations and no English as a middleman were expected. So rather than translate the poem, maybe act out the poem might be more effective.
Yeah, definitely. You could show understanding that way.
Somebody said they liked Adam's task, who said, choose the favorite poem and write in Latin why they like it. And they said they like that one as a presentational option.
Yes.
Apply each poem to a colleague/classmate and explain why. Write a short contemporary play or just several scenes using Marshall's poetry, acting out the poem, great. A video, shoot and upload a video of their visual interpretation of the poem. And find a similar modern poet and compare their writing. Would anybody like to chime in orally?
These are like my students. They like to use the chat function.
Yeah. Ellen Hart, who is from the North Carolina Virtual Public Schools, says she loves the arts aspect of all of these ideas, so bringing the arts in. Maria says pragmatics, ? Adapt his poems using a less sarcastic approach.
The sarcasm is so fun. What about the fact that these might have been, these are performed. I mean, the poet would stand up and he would recite them to an audience.
So how it's, Stephen says, I think we're weakest on the interpersonal. So I think We're seeing lots of presentational in that way, of performance.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Find the polite cultural portions in Marshall's otherwise caustic language.
That might be difficult.
Holly, Holly, go ahead. You have your hand raised. Go ahead and take the mic.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I wasn't sure how good the audio would be. I'm thinking what I tried to have my English students do, it's difficult for them, but if the level is high enough, you could get your students to dialogue with the poem, you know, sort of agree, disagree, and if their level is too low, then they could agree, disagree, you know, and they have to say why, do that in English. But if their level is higher, then that could be done in Latin. And if you want to get really challenging, have them agree, disagree with their own poem.
Definitely.
Olga had a lovely idea to sub current presidential candidates debates with relevant lines from Marshall's poetry.
How apt for this evening.
Yes, isn't it? Yeah, Maria says, sarcasm may be fun, but I was actually thinking of a way for students to learn or practice different ways of expressing the same ideas.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. Maria Carmen's idea about practicing different ways of expressing the same ideas really demonstrates comprehension. So it integrates the interpretive with the presentational in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody have any other interpersonal types of things that they could do?
Don't see any right this moment.
I did like the idea of doing sort of a lit crit analysis. I think at this level, it might be a little bit difficult. The students are still kind of, you know, especially if they're new to us, they're still sort of getting used to the whole idea that they landed themselves in a Latin course where they did not expect to have to speak or write, especially speak. We get a lot of the shy kids who are like, you know, this is why I took Latin, so I didn't have to do this. So we're kind of like try and be a little bit gentle about getting them in. Any other ideas coming through?
Not right now.
Stephen here, I'm going to jump in again. Sorry.
Yeah.
Overtaking the airwaves. Sometimes imposing a constraint can actually make a task more fun or easier in a way. So I was wondering if somehow having students make their own Marshall poem or their own poem in the style of Marshall, but they would have to use the same set of ingredients. In other words, everyone would brainstorm a list of people, places, things, and actions that could occur in the poem, or, you know, choose certain words from Marshall that they had to use in their poem, and they mash it up. They make their own poem sort of in the style.
Yeah, definitely.
But again, that's not interpersonal unless we can somehow make it into a dialogic process of composition between students who are working as partners. I really think we need to delve into the interpersonal part of this because it seems not to be coming out very well. Can you help us? Can you guide us?
I think that some of the things that we can do, you know, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about, you know, how I interpret interpersonal communication online in Latin, but I think that one of the things that we could have the students do, you know, where you're talking about, they can get together and they can talk about what would they do? I mean, that kind of a dialogue can take place in Latin. You know, students can say, you know, I think this word would be better. I think this word would be better. I think you could do this. I think you could do that. I mean, I don't see any reason why that discussion couldn't take place in Latin. So I think it's definitely a possibility. I think that also, you know, as I'll show you, one of the things that I'll do is the students will actually do a presentational task, and then they'll discuss each other's stuff, you know, and do some critiquing there, and trying to move them into, say, talking about text with each other in the target language as much as we're able to do at the level that they're at, if that makes sense. Shall we move on, or do we have other ideas? I guess we can kind of entertain ideas as they come up.
Sure. That
All
sounds good. I'll keep you updated on the chat.
Yeah, and my time too. I have to mouse until I can find this thing. Okay, so
it's 8:06, so you have about 20 more minutes or so.
Okay, awesome. So this is what I had developed for this particular thing. So this is the same context with the interpretive, presentational, and interpersonal tasks sort of filled in. And so, you know, obviously I can steal some of y'all's ideas, which is great, make changes. So one of the things that we do to move away from translation is stuff that people have been talking about. So we're looking at, you know, you read the text, and instead of putting it into English, you can summarize the main idea. You can, you know, identify supporting details. You can work with the vocabulary. You can connect things that you already know about Roman culture and history and values, etc., and make connections with the martial poem. And you can also relate those to the modern day, different cultures, any culture pretty much after the Romans, anything they might have influenced or been influenced by. So we work that in. And then I'll show you another type of interpretive task that we do also with students. Presentational task, we have the students compose a poem of their own in Latin. They're told to use a pseudonym because we don't want to insult anybody. And the Romans were very, very heavy duty on slander. So, you know, and so what we want to do there is, this would be a presentational speaking task. And so the students would present their poem spoken. They don't necessarily at this point have to put it in meter. We do that in Latin 3, where the students have to address the metrics. And that gives them, by the way, a tremendous appreciation for how hard it is to write poetry. And they stop complaining about why Virgil, for example, puts his noun way up there and his adjective modifying it way down here, because they're like, he had to do that because he had to fit the meter. And then the interpersonal task for us is on a discussion forum where they discuss other people's presentational tasks. They ask them questions that the other students will need to answer. They make comments about their poems, for example. You know, and this could probably be improved upon, but at least they're talking about it. So, so this is how we address this. And then what I thought I could do is show you a little bit more of the types of things that we're doing so you can sort of see student work. And so what we're trying to do mostly, again, is moving from translation to interpretive reading. And we're really sneaky about it. We actually put in a lot more reading of the Latin than, say, the kids are getting with the text, because their actual document is also in Latin. So we're trying to accustom them to reading more interpretive reading, and get some presentational writing in there. And so this is actually what I would call an interpretive reading document. This is a lesson 2 and level 1 document that the students are doing. And what you're seeing here is this is the document with the students' work in it. And then the red stuff is my commentary using track changes in Word. And so I don't know if y'all can see my cursor, but on this side, for example, the students are asked to give a summary of the passage in Latin, not necessarily in English. And so we're trying to stay in the target language there, you know, and they're just getting used to the whole idea that the subject's in the nominative case, the object's mostly in the accusative case, you know, some verbs don't take direct objects, you know, and so they're, you know, this student is doing quite well. We have them work with vocabulary, for example. We have them answer questions about the passage. One thing I should probably say, you know, I try to get my students, and this depends a lot on how many students you have, but I try and get my students to send me documents to look over for them before they turn them in for a grade. You know, this can be kind of tough to get the students used to this, but I think they find that it's actually better. And I feel like it's better because the students actually, I think if they send you a draft and you send it back with some comments and corrections and so on, they're much more likely to look at it than if you know, they just, you know, they turn it in for the grade, you put the grade on it. A lot of times students, in my experience, don't even look at the feedback. And so this is one attempt to try and get them to actually look at this stuff. This is a level 3 student reading Caesar. So he's reading authentic Latin. And you can see, same thing, he was asked to give a summary of a passage of Caesar. So he had to read the passage, he had to summarize the salient points. He did give me in his you know, this is what I meant to say in English, because I think he was worried that his Latin didn't come through, but his Latin is awesome. So, I mean, there's really not too many problems with that. And then when I send it back to him, I can say, hey, you know, remember, you know, if you have an indirect question, we use the subjunctive there, for example. And so I think that in a lot of ways, this builds knowledge of grammar, because the students are actually using it. They're not just passively receiving it in instruction and in reading. They're actually having to use this grammar. And I think it solidifies it in their own mind. You know, everything from why do we put this ending on this verb? Why does this have to be in the subjunctive? And then the students get super inventive with it. You know, they are asked to, you know, answer questions about the passage here. This student is just doing awesome. And they really, once they get used to this system, especially if they're mine from the beginning, they don't know there's another way. So, you know, I think that this has been working well. And again, it's sneaking in more interpretive reading, and it's sneaking in more presentational writing. And I am able to see what the students can know and can do with the language so much better than I used to be able to when it was just translating. This is, I'm just showing this as one of the ways that you can also ask students about things. This is an AP student, and if y'all know AP, it's all translate. So we do all this interpretive reading, and then the students are translate, translate, translate. And so in this particular case, the student and I are talking about interpretive reading of a passage, and I'm asking them, don't translate it, let's talk about what's happening in it. And this is using Blackboard Collaborate, which is a lot like Zoom. But I can upload my PowerPoint in there, and then we're doing the chat screen so I can see everything at the same time, which is good. So you can kind of see this is another way that we can do this, you know, like what's this passage about? Where does it come from? Can you recognize it? What's happening here? And so this is sort of sneaking this stuff into the AP level. Interpretive listening is a little bit more difficult for us dead languages than it is for y'all. I think that in my experience, it's a lot easier to find you know, modern language equivalents where you can have students listen to, you know, a news show or something, and then you can ask them questions, you know. So we kind of have to do this on the fly. There are some things out there, but it's pretty easy to incorporate this kind of stuff into instructional media for me. I can say, I can read a passage to them. I can ask them questions in Latin about what's going on in the passage, and then we can all discuss it on a forum, for example. We use a lot of forums. I use them for my presentational speaking, my presentational writing, interpersonal communication. I use them for discussing the units stuff. So we use them a lot for a lot of stuff. I use rubrics as much as possible for summative assessments, and then we use the forum for quick checks to see if students are understanding what's going on. I apologize, my cat is meowing. She wants to go outside. My animals. So presentational writing for us, this is where I really find out what a student knows. And again, I do this on the interpretive reading documents too, but in this particular case, a student was asked, he's, you know, describing, you know, a situation here. And I think that the one thing that I would emphasize for presentational writing, especially in Latin, is that it should be the student's own production of the Latin. It should not be, you know, where they're adapting something. And this is especially true in presentational speaking. And we've already talked about this. We don't want a student reciting, you know, an oration of Cicero and calling that presentational speaking. I don't. And so in order to implement these, what we do is we have discussion forum threads where students will post their presentational writing. And we do it on the forum. I used to do Twitter, and Twitter was so cool for this because you could actually have, you know, especially for the lower levels where there's the character limit, you know, so they couldn't be really vociferous. You know, they'd have to do a series of tweets. But we could also have students talking across levels of Latin. So I could have a student tweet to a Latin 1 student, Latin 3 student could talk to a Latin 2 student. It was cool. The problem for us was access. And then also Twitter can get a little weird if the students aren't very strict. Like I had them create their own Latin only account. I told them not to share with anybody that was outside of the class, etc. But we still had some issues. And so we have gone to forums for this. But this might work great at the college level. I think it could work really good. And then, you know, ideally you could tweet with people from outside of your program in the target language. And this is what we were trying to go for. But for middle and high school, it just wasn't quite what I wanted. It wasn't quite secure enough for me. Maybe some people have some better ideas. But we always have the students turn in a draft to the teacher for checking. And this is where we can dialogue with the student. We can explain constructions. You know, we would like to use this. We would like to use this. This is in our, students will contact me via text. They'll Skype me. This is in the student messaging system. They email me. I get stuff from all over. And then for the summative assessment, we use a rubric. This is a Latin 2 student, by the way. Here is an example of our forum with all this. I feel like such a censor, all the student data censored out. But what we have here is the student that we just saw. This is his presentational writing. He's put it up on the forum. But he's also responding on the forum to another student's post up here. And so, you know, this student says, you know, Rome always wins. And he says, no. You need to ask the Goths about that. So he's my sarcastic student. And so we incorporate the interpersonal communication right now, the written ones, into the forum itself, which, you know, will lead me into the whole synchronous discussion of interpersonal communication. I do give them writing prompts. You can see a writing prompt here. This is right at the beginning of Latin 2, where we ask the students to introduce themselves. We have a lot of students coming from outside the program, and then we have ones that came up with us. And then they need to respond to other students. And students know if there's a post on the forum that is directly addressing them, they need to go back to the forum and they need to reply. And so we hope to get conversations going with that. And then presentational speaking. Again, this is the one that I insist that the students do the writing here. So they will again send me a draft. We'll work through their grammar before they do the presentation on the forum. And this is the one where it can be a little bit difficult for us because students have access issues for recording video, recording their voices. And so we do have some in-course options. We use Moodle as our LMS, and so they can use Kaltura, which is embedded in, and that allows webcams or screen captures. They can also go to outside sites. Unfortunately, Go Animate now, I think, is pay. You know, it's too bad because it was super fun. But they can use something like Vocaroo, which is super fast, easy to use, and then they can upload that into the forum. They can use their phone to record themselves. And I do have one student's. This is what you're seeing on the screen here is his draft to me, and then I have his recording. So I'm going to play that, and I hope this won't be too loud.
Yeah, it's no good. Never mind. We should just move on.
Did that not work?
No, it still didn't work very well. Guess we have to move on.
I'm sorry. Sorry about that. All right, so I think that this is kind of leading into interpersonal communication. This is, I think, the biggest challenge for us online for the reason that, you know, it kind of depends on the course that you're teaching, the type of course. But you know, do you have a synchronous option? I know there are some online courses that where all the students are expected to meet at the same time, and you can put your interpersonal communication, say, on Blackboard collaborate and everybody talks together at the same time. But our courses are pretty much asynchronous. Our students are all over the map in terms of scheduling. It's very hard to require them to all be in one place at the same time. Blended though, if you're teaching a blended course, this is where you could use the class time, say, to do your interpersonal communication amongst the students, have them do maybe their presentational speaking even there, and then you could put other modes online. So the synchronous time, I think for modern languages, this is probably really important, that the students do have this time together. And so I know that there are some modern language programs that uses a language coach system. We're trying to move to that ourselves, where the language coach can schedule a bunch of different times that the students could possibly meet. But it's been a bugaboo for us, frankly. And so, one of the options could be possibly that students could schedule meetings together and make recordings of their interaction. But I think the problem there for high school and middle school students, they just need more supervision. They need to have a teacher's presence there. And so I think we have to decide for our own purposes, what's the most important thing? That the communication is synchronous rather than asynchronous, that it's unscripted, that it's negotiation of meaning. And for me, the last two are more important than the synchronous. And so for me, implementation on a forum is fine. I don't necessarily need the students to be online at the same time, but what I do want to see is that they are dialoguing with each other, in that they are negotiating meaning. They ask each other if they don't understand something, they respond. So I think that a lot of things have to be factored into that, including safety, internet safety, and student access. We grade this by rubric, by the way. This is just an example, super quick, of a Latin 3 student that this is all interpersonal communication. She was writing about whether it was appropriate to use capital punishment for capital crimes, what we would consider to be capital crimes. And so she had done her presentational writing on this. This was in a unit on Cicero, who was, part lawyer. And so this is all her engaging other students with charts and maps, and she's writing a lot, and it's not necessarily all correct, but it's fine. I don't check drafts of this. I want this all to be between students. And so, she came out with all of this stuff, which I just thought was super cool. She got very into it, and this took her a lot of time. Always fun to see. And it's good that she's feeling comfortable taking chances, that she doesn't have to worry so much about making mistakes. She's just trying to communicate with her colleagues. How am I doing on time?
You have just a few more minutes. It's 8:24, so you have until 8:30. I don't know if you want to save a little bit of time for Q&A, or if you just would like to finish your presentation, and we can let the questions sort of be there on the chat, and maybe you could answer some of them within the chat after your presentation is done.
Yeah, I think this is pretty much self-explanatory. Just creating a safe environment for students to ask for help when they need it, having help structures there for the students, and just being aware of limitations. For us, that's mostly technology and internet, and giving a lot of options, and keeping things simple. So I can skip most of that. Okay. Let me see. I'm trying to get my little things. Okay, and then I just had this. So I can go ahead and stop sharing, and if that's cool.
Sure.
All right.
Yeah, there were just, so there was a little bit of sharing going on here about the forums, or fora, if we're being correct. Is that correct?
Yes, fora, yeah, for the plural. That's neuter.
And somebody was saying that they use their text chat within their learning management system. And I don't know if you have experience with the difference between using the different forums. Some people said they use Google Hangouts, some of them use Skype. Do you have any experience comparing your use of text chat with the forums? Are there pros and cons there that you're aware of?
Yeah, I have used actually. I've used Skype. So if I'll just make a group Skype with all of the students who have, and Skype is a requirement for us. I should probably say I do require all the students to get Skype because it's just a really good way for them to ask questions. And once they figure out it's like texting but faster, they're usually fine with it. And it's not a mandatory sort of thing. I haven't required that they all get on the group. And of course, we have the same problem with the synchronicity because they don't necessarily get on at the same time, but it is another resource for them. I do have a lot of students that Skype me privately also. So it does work well, and it could work well for this. It's just a question of getting everybody on at the same time if we're expecting it to be synchronous.